Millions of people laughed at Stan Laurel's amusing expression, but there was a broken heart hidden beneath that grin. 9 days later, his little son passed away. One by one, his marriages broke down. He was accused by his spouse of attempting to bury her alive. Both his properties and his money were lost. Stan too lost a piece of himself when Hardy passed away in 1957, but what transpired in his latter years was even more tragic. It's almost hard to avoid crying. On June 16, 1890, he was born Arthur Stanley Jefferson in a small Ulverston, England, home. Theatre was the lifeblood of his family. His father was an actor, playwright, and theatrical manager. Prior to becoming a theatrical performer, his mother worked as a store assistant. Stan, however, was a sickly child. He lived with his grandma, out of the spotlight, while his parents were on tour. Nevertheless, he developed an obsession with it. He played with puppets, constructed toy theaters, and performed for his neighbors, complete with makeup and costumes. It was more than a pastime. It was a silent practice run for what was ahead. Everything changed when he was 15 years old. In order to be near the Metropole Theatre, which his father operated, his family relocated to Glasgow. Despite his lack of interest in reading, Stan was accepted to Queen's Park School. He frequently missed class, rather he slipped away to play with the little band of his buddy Willie Walker. It was genuine, even though it wasn't flashy. It provided him with an audience, which school was never able to provide, and he just ever desired that. He broke into the storied Britannia Panopticon Music Hall in 1906, just before his 16th birthday. He went on stage wearing one of his father's most valuable outfits, without alerting his father. The audience chuckled, but the biggest surprise was when he turned to face his father and discovered him looking back at him. Stan ran off stage in a panic and tore the coat off a hanger. He was afraid. However, his father only said, "Not bad, son," following the performance. "Have a Coke and some whiskey." That instant said it all. He deserved to be on stage. Soon after, his father used his connections to land him a position with a touring pantomime company. They told fairy stories in a humorous way. It wasn't simple. He needed to develop his mobility, timing, and crowd-reading skills. They did do one concert after another, perhaps several in a single day, but he was picking things up quickly. These shows weren't simply for children, they served as practice areas. Then Fred Carnot arrived. In Britain, Carnot was the comic king. He led a group of actors, who were well known for their hand drawings. Stan was engaged by Carnot in 1909, at the age of 19. He soon started working as Charlie Chaplin's understudy, a young comedian that was enormous. During tours, they lived together, traveled together, and performed together. Spoken lines were not used in Carnot's performances. It was all physical. Stan had to learn timing, nuance, and body language as a result. He paid close attention to Chaplin, but he never attempted to emulate him. He was establishing his own cadence. Carnot's troops made another trip to America in 1912. This journey would alter Stan's life, even though he was unaware of it at the time. In England, he was having a hard time and just getting by. The invitation to take a US tour arrived at the perfect moment. He assumed it would be short-term. No, it wasn't. Chaplin departed for Hollywood at the conclusion of the tour. Bookings stopped coming in. The group broke up. Most headed home. Stan didn't. He remained. He was 22, hopeful, yet broken. He was aware that America had something in store for him. He wandered around vaudeville for years, frequently portraying Chaplin-esque characters. He created a partnership with his on-stage and off-stage partner, May Dahlberg. They led a married life together, but never got married. Nuts in May, a short film they shot in 1917, was his first appearance on screen. However, it didn't do well. Stan was at his best in it, physical, clumsy, and charming. In the movie, he even stole a steamroller, which eventually became a common joke. At this point, May informed him that Stan Jefferson had 13 letters. He changed his name to Stan Laurel because she believed it to be unlucky. Success didn't happen right away, but the new name seemed lighter and more optimistic. He was confined to little parts, strange skits, and forgotten comedies for years. Despite his humor, producers were unsure about how to handle him. Then Joe Rock arrived. Rock saw Stan's promise by 1924, but May had turned into an issue. She argued with Stan backstage, demanded parts, and battled with producers. Stan was given a 12-film deal by Rock, but there was a catch. May had to go. Rock purchased her a ticket to Australia and paid her to depart after she refused. Although it was painful, it made the path plain. Stan produced comedies such as Mr. Pride, Dr. Pickle, High-Eyed, and Detained. Although they weren't huge hits, they demonstrated something significant. He had developed a modest, kind and expressive style of his own. He responded to the turmoil, rather than fighting it, and laughter was heard. Stan Laurel joined Hal Roach Studios in 1925, but he wasn't a celebrity. He was brought on as a writer and director. He worked behind the camera on at least 22 films in a little more than a year. Among them was the comedy Yes, Yes, Nanette. Oliver Hardy played a little part in it. Nobody gave it any thought at the moment. In that, Laurel didn't even appear, but after Hardy was injured, everything was different. In an accident in the kitchen, the studio needed someone to cover for him while he was in the hospital. Thus they gave Laurel a call. Despite his displeasure, he went back to acting for the short film Get 'Em Young. His life will never be the same after he made that one choice to just fill in. Years before, Laurel and Hardy had made an appearance together. They filmed The Lucky Dog back in 1921. It didn't work out. It was hardly even noteworthy. Although they appeared together in a few situations, they weren't a team. They didn't see one another for 2 or 3 years after that. Hardy continued to work. He performed a variety of roles: hero, antagonist, and even a lady in disguise. Together with the Vim Comedy Company, he produced 177 short films. However, Laurel was having trouble. He made an effort to do it alone. He experimented with many studios. He experimented with several names. However, nothing seemed to click. He was mostly solely perceived by American viewers as a silly burglar or priest clone. It was insufficient. Not even those behind the camera knew how to handle him. In 1926, he returned to Hal Roach after bouncing between Metro and Universal. No one knew how to use the skills he possessed. His true name was Arthur Stanley Jefferson, but after working with May Dahlberg on the May film Nuts, he adopted the moniker Stan Laurel. It wasn't until 1931 that he even changed his name legally. Although it was a chaotic time in his life, it made him hone his sense of humor, though he was unaware of it at the time. He was preparing for something more significant. That something came in 1927. Putting Pants on Philip was the title. It was the pair's first official motion picture. Laurel portrayed a kilted, naive Scottish kid. Hardy portrayed his humiliated uncle from America. It was an easy narrative. However, it was successful. Laurel came up with the concept. People adored it, and it was based on an ancient story he had heard from a friend. It became one of their most distinctive comedies, according to film historians. The magic was there, but the Stan and Ollie style wasn't quite there yet. Director Leo McCarey of Roach Studios noticed the spark right away. Keep them together, he urged the studio. Over the course of 3 decades, just one statement resulted in 107 films. Then The Noise. It was a career-ending event for the majority of silent cinema stars, but not for Laurel and Hardy. They published Unaccustomed as We Are in 1929. Their first talking picture was successful. Although Laurel's voice was high-pitched, soft and somewhat infantile, it was appropriate and made people laugh. Laurel and Hardy went forward, while other comedians faltered. Laurel began to take charge behind the scenes. Scenes were rewritten by him. He promoted improvisation. He was in the editing room for hours. Although there were writers and directors on the set, everyone understood who was in charge. Later, Roach acknowledged it. Laurel was in charge of the production. He was the primary author by 1929. Though wild and disorganized, their writing sessions were jam-packed with ideas. Hardy was not bothered. "I merely did the gags," he joked. After getting into so many mud holes, that was sufficient. Stan Laurel was experiencing a surge of success in May 1930. He and Oliver Hardy were quickly rising to prominence as one of Hollywood's most popular comic duos. His wife, Lois, gave birth to their second child that same month. It was a boy. Stanley Robert Laurel was his given name. Their house was briefly filled with optimism and pleasure, despite the fact that he was born 2 months early and extremely little. Stan's official name was still Arthur Stanley Jefferson at the time, something that most fans are unaware of. It took him 4 years before he was formally known as Stan Laurel. This indicated that Jefferson, not Laurel, was the baby's true last name. Nevertheless, the advent of the young kid seemed like a new start. In 1927, Stan and Lois already had a daughter. They now also have a son. The couple had desired another kid, and now he was here, despite Stan's hectic movie schedule. However, such happiness was short-lived. The infant was very frail. He was born with a little physique that struggled. Stanley Robert Laurel passed away 9 days after birth. Stan and Lois were devastated by the loss. It was more than simply heartache. It was an injury that would never go away. Stan never discussed it much in public. On the inside he was grieving, yet he made millions laugh. It was made worse by the time. Stan was going through a personal nightmare at the same time as the world was honoring Laurel and Hardy. They had been cautioned by the physicians. There were no sophisticated devices to assist preterm newborns back then. It seemed like a war every hour. Ultimately they were defeated. Stan's perception of May changed drastically after that day. He would frequently become silent and reclusive around his son's birthday, according to friends. On set he would occasionally disappear in between scenes. Even if his eyes would be red when he returned, his comedy would still be flawless. He seemed to mask the agony with laughing. During the years 1930 to 1935, Stan's career blossomed. In just 5 years, he produced almost 45 pictures. A lot of them were big hits. The Music Box even took home an Academy Award in 1932. At home, however, everything were unraveling. Stan and Lois were gradually torn apart by their grief at the loss of their son. They made an unsuccessful attempt to hold everything together. They were separated by a wall of anguish. They grew farther apart the more Stan worked. They were married for 8 years until divorcing at the end of 1934. They had previously been living apart for more than a year, according to court documents. Stan became lost in his task. Lois emotionally distanced herself. Lois Jr., their daughter, spent much of her time with her mother. She was just 7 years old. She survived for many years until dying in 2017 at the age of 89. Stan got married again a month after his divorce. Virginia Ruth Rogers was her name. The marriage didn't endure, but friends claimed he was attempting to run away from his background. Stan made a startling admission in court. He still had feelings for his previous wife, Lois. It must have devastated Virginia. Despite their 1937 divorce, their relationship continued. In an odd turn of events, Stan remarried her in 1941 and then divorced her once more in 1946. Despite the fact that neither marriage produced any children, their intermittent relationship became the subject of Hollywood rumors. Stan wasn't finished with drama or love, either. Stan remarried on New Year's Day 1938. Vera Ivanova Shuvalova, a Russian actress, was the one this time. She was known as Ilyana. Everyone was taken aback by the wedding. Only a few days had passed since his previous divorce. He was charged with bigamy by Virginia. Both the connection and the time were messed up. To make sure it was legal, they were married 3 times in 4 months. The media praised it. Their altercations made news. Stan was now perceived as the humorous man with a tumultuous romantic life. The most crazy portion followed. Ilyana accused Stan of attempting to bury her alive in 1938. She did really claim that he attempted to murder her in their own garden. It was a crazy allegation. They were unsure about what to believe. Stan has always portrayed a kind, silly persona. Fans were now learning about a dangerous and sinister side of him. Ilyana fled their house and told her story to the world. The damage was done, but there was never complete confirmation. His reputation suffered greatly. The marriage ended in 1940. For $6,500, a substantial amount at the time, Ileana consented to give up the Laurel name. Stan married 5 different ladies in 8 separate wedding ceremonies between 1926 and 1946. There were invalid weddings. A few were repeated. It reminded me of a soap opera, and that all took place when he was producing classic humor on screen. Following all of that, he was married one final time in 1946. Ida Rafael was her name. She was an opera singer from Russia. This union endured. Ida remained at Stan's side for 19 years until his death in 1965. She remained at his side during his dying days and the ups and downs of his decline following Oliver Hardy's death in 1957. For Laurel and Hardy, however, everything changed in 1932. The music box turned them become legends, even though they had been making people laugh for years. Although it appeared to be a straightforward piano delivery, this piano was more than simply hefty. They had to pull it up a never-ending stairway. It dropped each time they approached. People watched in cinemas, laughing uncontrollably as the piano slid down repeatedly, as if fate were working against them. They were creating history in addition to being amusing. The first ever Academy Award for a comedy short was handed to them for the short film. And that staircase remains now, over a century later, as if it were a sacred site. Tourists flock there. However, the majority of individuals were unaware of this. When anything went wrong, Stan Laurel was more than simply the person who sobbed and scratched his head. He was the creative force behind the scenes, the editor, the writer, and the one who made the decisions. He had complete authority over the creative process by 1929. If Stan didn't do anything that a director requested, it didn't happen. Their producer, Hal Roach, freely acknowledged that. He had the last word, but Laurel refused to claim credit. Scenes were rewritten by him. Films were trimmed and recut until the pace was flawless, and every joke was timed. And Hardy didn't mind at all. He famously remarked, "I earned my money just by getting hit all day and falling in mud." Contrast was what gave them their on-screen charm. Hardy weighed about 280 pounds and was over 6 feet tall. He always made a mess of things, seemed like he knew everything, and had a bossy appearance. Laurel was quieter, smaller, and more perplexed. Don't be duped, though. A keen comedic brain smote his naive face. People underestimated him, both on and off screen. They each took turns being the idiot, defying the typical dynamic of funny man and straight man. That was the difference between them, and that resonated with viewers throughout the Great Depression. In the confusion, the conflict, and the hilarity, they recognized themselves. They had a harsh work schedule. They produced more than 40 films between 1930 and 1940. That is over 4 each year. Furthermore, they were more than just talking heads captured on video. Hardy and Laurel performed their own stunts. No trickery, no doubles, actual falls and actual injuries. They repeatedly pulled a 500-pound piano up and down stairs in the music box until their bodies failed. Behind the laughter, you could see the real suffering, the limps, and the perspiration. And it only covers one movie. They shot 5 complete productions in 1935 alone. Tit for Tat, Bonnie Scotland, Thicker Than Water, The Bohemian Girl, and The Fixer-Uppers. They are not the type of schedule that breaks people. Stan Laurel didn't collapse all at once. It was terrible, embarrassing, and slow. It began when his collaboration with Hal Roach broke down in the late 1930s. The contracts were set up by Roach so that Hardy's and Laurel's would expire at different periods. It was an act of power, and Roach didn't wait for Laurel's contract to expire. In Zenobia, he coupled Hardy with Harry Langdon, another comic. A smack in the face was what it was. Roach even suggested a new show called The Hardy Family as a complete replacement for Laurel. Laurel retaliated. In a bold step that may have ended everything, he sued Roach. They eventually reached an agreement, and Laurel came back for a short while to complete 2 more movies, Saps at Sea and A Chump at Oxford. But that was all. They were leaving Roach Studios. The fissures were now too deep. Their transition to MGM and 20th Century Fox in the early 1940s appeared to be a step forward, but it wasn't. It was a catastrophe. Their humor had always been conceived by Laurel. He hosted lively brainstorming sessions, altered screenplays, and directed sequences without giving credit. However, he was only a hired actor in the new studios. Nothing, no control, no say. They produced 8 movies from 1941 to 1944. Each budget ranged from about $300,000 to $450,000. The movies made money, but not much. The enchantment was gone though. Hardy and Laurel had ceased to be artists. They were goods. The studios were primarily interested in making money. It was too late, even when Fox eventually granted them a little more artistic latitude. Already, the harm was done. The Bullfighters, their last Hollywood production, was released in 1945. It was supposed to be humorous. In fact, Laurel had a dual part that reminded him of his silent cinema days. However, something didn't feel right. There was no energy. Although it didn't seem like the original Laurel and Hardy, the movie made many grin. In the background, Fox was closing its B-movie business. They were no longer regarded by the studio as stars, but rather as elderly comedians from a bygone period. Thus, this movie became their farewell to America. In 1950, A Tall K followed. This was to be their resurgence. $150,000 apiece. A European production, complete creative power, and a hefty salary. Extra earnings, but it became a nightmare. 6 distinct languages were spoken by the crew. There was a breakdown in communication. The filming process was chaotic. Laurel became ill. He dropped more than 40 pounds and suffered from diarrhea and a prostate infection. Hardy's cardiac issues worsened. His 300-pound weight, the heat, and the stress didn't help. What was supposed to be a 12-week shoot took over a year to complete. Additionally, the script is revised daily. Fans were taken aback when the movie was eventually released in 1951. Laurel had a ghostly appearance. It was a stuffy comedy. A Tall K flopped. Their cinematic career came to an end. After that, they would perform on stage, but Hardy's condition continued to deteriorate. It was all over by 1954. Laurel's private life was equally disorganized. He was simultaneously paying alimony to 3 ex-wives by 1946. In 1934, he was divorced from his first wife, Lois Nielsen. In 1935, he wed Virginia Ruth Rogers, but they divorced by 1937. In 1938, he wed Ileana Shuvalova. That too came to an end. In exchange for her dropping the Laurel name, he gave her $6,500. He remarried Virginia Ruth in 1941. In 1946, they were divorced once more. According to court documents, 65% of his salary was allocated to alimony. He was still having trouble making ends meet despite earning thousands of dollars every picture, and May Dahlberg came back just as things were getting out of hand. Years before, she had been his vaudeville partner. He vowed to support her for the rest of her life. She said. She sued him in 1937. She brought anecdotes and scrapbooks to court. Laurel seemed ill at the mere sound of them. The court case received attention. Dahlberg stated that she wanted $350 each month, which is equivalent to $6,500 in current currency. Laurel was required to pay legal expenses and a new monthly responsibility despite the matter being discreetly settled. Around $360,000 was lost by Laurel between 1937 and 1944. Today, that is more over $6.5 million. Because he trusted the wrong people, most notably his cousin Edgar, who lacked financial expertise, the money vanished. Edgar lost $175,000 all at once after investing in unsuccessful oil enterprises. For 3 years he also failed to submit Laurel's taxes. The IRS assessed a $42,000 penalty as a result. Drinking by Laurel didn't help either. After drinking too much one night in 1940, he purchased 3 expensive vehicles. He was not even able to drive them. His vision was extremely poor. In 1941, he was likewise unsuccessful in negotiating a reasonable deal with 20th Century Fox. No ownership of the characters or creative control. He was only an employee. He started taking out loans from Hardy in 1944 to cover his expenses. His family life also fell apart. He had to sell his 18-room Cheviot Hills estate in 1942 at a 40% loss. It had a private cinema room, tennis courts and a pool. Everything is gone. The furniture was put up for auction. His prized 1938 Rolls-Royce Phantom III brought only $1,200 at auction. He was residing in a modest two-bedroom Santa Monica apartment by 1943. According to friends, he appeared dejected. His wife Ida had to work at a department shop in 1945 to help pay the bills since things had become so terrible. He continued to make movie appearances, but the main money was going to the studios. He fought Hal Roach in court for 4 years, from 1935 to 1939. It began when he learned that Roach had purposefully broken their contracts. In 1935, Laurel sued, but Roach had 7 attorneys. Laurel only had 1. Roach openly referred to him as tough and untrustworthy. He was exhausted by the protracted lawsuit. Hardy remained with Roach and co-starred with Harry Langdon in Zenobia. The fans were heartbroken. According to reports, Laurel lost $50,000 in the court dispute. He never received the money back. The trust was shattered even after coming back for 2 more movies with Roach, and it was like déjà vu when he later signed with 20th Century Fox, won another agreement devoid of creative rights. He was simply another name on the payroll at another studio. Laurel and Hardy took a break after the release of their final film Atoll K in 1951. They needed to slow down since their health was deteriorating. However, they returned with renewed vigor and strength after a few months. They went back to Europe in 1952 for live performances rather than a movie. A Spot of Trouble, a brand new skit that Stan Laurel penned, was a huge success. They performed Birds of a Feather, another performance, after it in 1953. Then one of the most poignant times in their life occurred. On September 9, 1953, they landed at Cove, Ireland. They were caught off guard by what transpired there. The harbor was encircled by hundreds of vessels. There were whistles. On the docks, people cheered and hollered. Later, Stan claimed that they were unaware of what was happening. Then, however, the town's signature tune, Dance of the Cuckoos, began to sound from every church bell. The air was filled with the music. Both men sobbed. They would never forget that moment. They traveled via Scotland, Ireland, and England. Some concerts had unfilled seats at initially. However, as news got out, more and more individuals showed there. For 8 months they gave performances. Their last performance was placed at Plymouth's Palace Theatre on May 17, 1954. Oliver Hardy suffered a small heart attack shortly after the curtain came down. Even after the tour ended, a local critic applauded them, stating that their crazy and wit had not diminished. Then the most difficult phase arrived. Doctors cautioned Hardy about his heart in 1956. He made an effort to alter his life. He shed around 45 kilograms and more than 100 pounds. Very large abdomen, which had been a source of amusement for years, was no longer there. However, catastrophe happened despite the weight drop. Hardy suffered a severe stroke. He was immobile. He was speechless. It was a tragic turn of events for a man whose entire life revolved on time and expressiveness. He didn't perform again. Stan Laurel stayed with him. Despite his frequent visits, he remained silent. He did not wish for Hardy to feel guilty about his inability to respond. The 2 males, who had begun in silent movies, managed to express themselves without using words. They made use of their eyes, signals and little movements. That was sufficient. Language was not necessary for their link, but the sickness took everything away. In order to pay the debts, Hardy had to sell his residence. The truth was revealed to the globe. Fame did not equate to wealth. Not in those days. August 1957 was Hardy's death month. Stan Laurel came 8 years later. He was 74. The incident took place in Santa Monica on February 23, 1965. Stan was joking, even in his final moments. At that moment, he expressed his desire to go skiing to his nurse. The joke was light, stupid, memorable, and pure Laurel, yet he was bedridden. Even though he hadn't performed in a decade, his spirit remained unwavering.